Well, hello everybody. Welcome into Great Atmosphere. Hope everyone had a great weekend. It is January 29th of 2024, and well, this has been quite a departure from the norm. It's pretty calm out there across the entire contiguous U.S. We had a cold front that unfortunately got rid of all that nice warm air that we were enjoying last week, and we're back to more mild and climatological average temperatures throughout the southeast and pretty much for the whole of the United States. And we can see some residual gravity waves and valley fog in the Ohio River Valley this morning, and the remains of the snowpack that affected portions of the Midwest still out there. But largely very, very calm as we move forward into our week. Taking a look at what our pressure map looks like, and it's largely reflected by high pressure dominating the eastern seaboard and the Rocky Mountain Plateau as well. So generally speaking, calm conditions, clear conditions across the majority of the states, and that's reflected by our satellite, which shows nary a cloud in the sky right now. We'll move forward into what we know is going to be our next, at least minor system that'll come in Tuesday evening into Wednesday early, about midday on Wednesday. And it begins here Tuesday afternoon with a broad upper level low that starts to dip down over the Midwest. It's a significant trough that I believe the models have almost cut off here, and ultimately is very quickly pushed out to sea. But as far as areas of confluence and divergence, because this is a trough that is generally moving from the northwest to the southeast, not a lot of areas for it to pull moisture from. Its only primary moisture component will be coming from the Great Lakes, and ultimately that's just not enough to get over the mountains typically for us. So as we move forward, we'll go through with the 300 millibar GFS. Surface winds and or not surface 300 millibar heights and winds, and you can see that it generally moves out to sea, and we are left with even more of a nice and clear mild condition going into the rest of the week post Wednesday afternoon. You can take a look at the energy ribbons and the 500 millibar relative vorticity map. Once again, we're looking in these ribbons, we're looking for areas where the grays and blacks are right next to areas of deep reds and purples, and we see that there are little perturbations that pop up right around our problem time there in the Blue Ridge Escarpment and the eastward facing slopes, and even both on westward facing slopes of the Appalachians as well, which will probably get the hardest hit out of all of this in terms of a precipitation accumulation amount. But ultimately, it's going to have the perturbations necessary. But ultimately, those isobars are just or those geopotential height lines are a little bit too far apart for them to actually have a major initiator. We'll get some like probably a couple tenths out of it in terms of precipitation here in the Piedmont of the Carolinas. But ultimately, it's not a lot to write home about. Not a lot in the ways of convective initiation. Not a lot of energy in the atmosphere as far as like CAPE levels. I haven't checked convective inhibition today, but I imagine it's relatively limited as well. Taking a look at what kind of moisture we're talking about, actually. So we can see this is our precipitable water map. We'll go forward in time here. You can see that it starts to draw moisture, and actually the moisture at first, due to that troughing, actually draws a little bit from the Gulf, but it gets caught up as the system starts to preclude over the Appalachian Mountains. And we get a very brief amount of time here in the southeast to be in that warm, moist sector before the low ultimately brings about its dry slot in and around behind it. And we dry out relatively quickly, and that's ultimately going to be all she wrote for this particular upcoming system. And that's actually the same one. So we look at what the temperatures are going to be looking like here in the next couple of days. Generally speaking, going to be largely climatologically normal. Will be a little bit warmer at night going into the next few, but then after that low passes through, we'll be dipping down into the mid 30s in the southeast states, and then mid 50s, maybe touch the 60s periodically every now and again as a maximum high on the high end of the max. But ultimately, it's a lot of the same in terms of temperatures going through. This is all the way through next weekend. Not a lot to write home about in terms of temperature being the primary story going into the next few days. Taking a look at what our polar vortex is looking like right at the moment. Here on Monday, the polar vortex is still relatively strong. Currently centered over, I believe, over the Siberian continent, and ultimately it's keeping all of that cold and dry air trapped up at the Arctic, and ultimately not going to give us too many opportunities to get down to the wintry feelings. We're going to be much more around in the 50s, and our climate mean averages going forward in the next 10 days, as long as that polar vortex up in the Arctic remains as strong as it is. But there might be some indications later on that show us that perhaps this polar vortex, if given the right amount of oomph, it might it might precipitate and get a little bit of an interruption in this flow, particularly over that problem area over the Bering Strait, coming up over the next couple of weeks. As far as what our temperature anomalies are going to be looking like, generally speaking, warm by comparison. Now, I know I said we're going to be near climatological average. Whenever we're generally here in the southeast going to be in this 4 to 5 degree higher than normal. So it's like if we're forecast to be 50 degrees on an average day this time in the span of past 120 years, however long they've been keeping records, then obviously it's going to come out red. It's going to look like we're like a ton warmer than we're not. A ton warmer would be in these pinks and light reds out here in the Central Plains. They're well over average going into this week. We're just a little bit above average going into the latter half of this work week. But largely, if you have whites and reds and blues right on top of one another, the models are pretty much saying that we're going to be right where we should be going forward. And it looks like maybe the GFS is predicting perhaps a return to some more colder temperatures into next week, but we're going to have to take a look at that a little bit further down the road. We'll take a look now at the how much precipitation we're expected to get out of this Wednesday system. As you can see, there's just not a lot of moisture return out of this. We're talking maybe like 3 or 4/10 of an inch across the Carolinas, and not even going to touch most of central Georgia and points southward. Mainly an Ohio River event, and as that flow is coming off of the Great Lakes, once it hits a higher elevation, we're going to get some more altitudinally forced precipitation events over West Virginia and over in the far right reaches of the Blue Ridge on the westward facing slopes. And even then, probably only an inch and a half, 1 to 1.25 inches, and that's a good amount of it, depending on the elevation, might come down as snow, which will definitely help out the ski slopes in those particular regions. So we'll take a look at what that radar is going to be looking like going forward, and you can see that low starting to really tighten up. Now there is a good chance of a little bit of an icing event over central Indiana and Ohio right before the snow really starts to kick in, and largely it will still forecast until it hits the Ohio River itself. Generally speaking, does stay largely rain and just light flurries, and as we go forward, it says mainly over Tuesday overnight hours, and then lingering showers going into Wednesday morning before this all clears out and it starts to tighten off of the coast. So really quick system. Take a look. Now we're going to shift forward real quick into what our climatological, some of our teleconnections are saying right now. This is quite a big departure. The North Pacific Jet is currently in a extension at the moment, which is ultimately going to be the primary driver for our forecasted atmospheric river event that'll be affecting the majority of the West Coast here over the next week or so, and it'll generally be ongoing in both the Pacific Northwest and the southern reaches of the Southwest as well. And this is probably something that's going to remain in place for a while, but the ensembles are saying that now it's more favorable for a jet retraction, but also more of a poleward shift. And anytime you get a very stark change from equatorward to poleward, there usually is a big self-correcting mechanism that goes in here that ultimately lends itself to a big atmospheric river event or a cutoff low or something like that in the Pacific that ultimately kind of destabilizes the atmosphere over the large portions of the contiguous U.S. So we're definitely going to have to take a look at this as we move forward. But ultimately, that North Pacific jet, as we can see that, is currently in place actually the extension is starting to move forward right now. But the forecast for the North Pacific jet diagram, this is out till about February 6th, 4th, 5th, when it's predicting it for it to retract again. But until that time, it will extend out all the way into the West Coast. Oops, sorry about that. It just died on me for. And it will continue to impact the West Coast and deliver kind of that split level flow into the rest of this week. You can see, generally speaking, how it starts to kind of go off in this direction with the high pressure center right around here, moving anticyclonically like this, and ultimately kind of working to develop a little bit of a blocking pattern over the Rocky Mountains and the Central Plains, delivering quite a bit of moisture precipitation, particularly in areas in that left exit region of the jet, which would probably be right in this general region right here. Should get a significant amount of rainfall by comparison to its climatological norm, which that area certainly needs it. Hopefully it won't be to the extent that we saw in San Diego last week, where we had quite a bit of flooding that impacted areas it was just a little bit too quick. That area has quite impervious soils, just because it's not used to receiving that much rainfall all at once, so it lends itself to landslides, mudslides, and flash flooding quite easily. So that's one thing to keep an eye on. It certainly won't be a generational biblical event like many people on Twitter were predicting last week, but it's certainly one of those things that happen. Atmospheric rivers happen, and specifically when particularly teleconnections like the North Pacific jet is in an extension, and the Madden-Julian oscillation is moving into phase 7 or 8. Those are kind of things that we already talked about the polar vortex being way up in the atmosphere, being way up in the Arctic reaches. Those are all things that generally contribute to this. And also here in the southeast, it does mean that as far as upper level flow is concerned, we still have that strong subtropical jet going over majority Florida as far as impacts are concerned on the surface level here. But the overall forcing remains the same in the upper levels. That subtropical jet has been screaming over top of us for the majority of the, at least this first month of winter. We can take a look at how this is how the Climate Prediction Center is kind of orienting this, and it's generally speaking reflecting that North Pacific jet quite well. You see well above average precipitation across the entire southwestern tier, and that high pressure ultimately is opening itself up for an increase in temperatures over both the north central plains and the Midwest, and even the Northeast in terms of drying them out, and perhaps even some above average temperatures for the year. So very mild and very dry for those particular regions that honestly probably could use a little bit more precipitation, particularly in that Wisconsin-Minnesota region. But ultimately, these areas have been impacted by quite a bit of snow and ice recently. This is probably a nice little reprieve from it as we move forward. And that, even going into weeks 3 and 4, we expect the precipitation amounts to largely stay in those southwestern regions, and Northeast to remain dry. But it's interesting to see where they're saying as far as below average temperatures in the southeastern tier going into mid-February. Perhaps we'll be able to kind of maybe see in the next couple of slides why that is. So one of the things that we talk about quite consistently here is the Madden-Julian oscillation, but we never actually legitimately talked about it. So essentially what the Madden-Julian oscillation ultimately is there's this big area. Let's see if I can get a global model. It's probably a cleaner one. Here we go. So the Madden-Julian oscillation essentially cuts the entire world into 8 different phases. And essentially all it is, it's just a measurement of an area of intense tropical convergence that moves around the globe in a big tropical moisture blob for the entirety of usually about 1 to 2 months, and then it'll reset itself. So the first phase, and this one connection, generally speaking, will be well, like, for example, so like right now, the Madden-Julian oscillation, according to the temperature diagram, or its GFS phase diagram, is currently supposed to be forecasted to remain in phase 7, which is over the Western Pacific. Now, if we look on our map right here, that would generally put it in this general region right here, in the in this particular region, and that would be phase 7, phase phase 6 to 7. That would generally be where that lies. Now, when that amount of moisture convergence is present in that particular region of MJO Phase 7, now what does that particularly mean for here in the southeast U.S.? Typically, it means that strong subtropical westerly flow develops, which is what we saw aloft here. So we got that strong subtropical westerly flow, so check, and then it also has a chance to spark off an atmospheric river event, which affects the west coast during that week 2 period, which is precisely what we are expecting moving forward, as that Madden-Julian oscillation has sat there in that area for quite a bit of time. The Climate Prediction Center put out its atmospheric river warning for the Southwest, partially due to what the MJO was currently doing. Now, in terms of what that means weather-wise for us, if the Madden-Julian oscillation starts to move more towards phase 8, back to the Western Hemisphere and portions of Africa, because the MJO kind of does like a weird thing. It'll come out to the middle of the Pacific, and then it'll die, and then it'll restart again over Central Africa. Not a lot of Atlantic anything going on with it, unfortunately. But ultimately, it still is a climate driver for us here in the States. And when the Madden-Julian oscillation makes its final kind of turn and gets into phase 8, which would be here in the Central Pacific, near that Nino 3.4 region, that's when things really start to kick off and destabilize here, in our neck of the woods here in the U.S., because it usually kicks off a good amount of low pressure. A low pressure system typically deepens off of the Bering Strait, which will disrupt the polar vortex, and the polar vortex then gets all discombobulated and will start to channel more cold air down into the central plains, which means that it gets advected over the southeast. But that subtropical ridge is still there because we're still in a strong El Nino. So we have plenty of moisture, and we'll have plenty of cold air, and it's just a matter of getting the right forcing in place. And based off what we're looking at over the next couple of days or a week or two, we're definitely going to have our fair share of low pressure systems that are going to be making its way off of the western over in the eastern Pacific. We can see that beginning atmospheric rivers start to coalesce by way of this low pressure center off of the coast of Washington and British Columbia, and ultimately that will work all that moisture over the southwest. But one thing that's definitely concerning for me is when this high pressure starts to build in, and this is one of those blocking patterns that generally induces quite a bit more moisture flow, just because if high pressure is aloft here over the Bering Strait, that means that all that moisture has to wrap around it, kind of like a ridge rider, but on a southerly scale, or southern rider, I guess is what it's called. And that just enhances a lot of the moisture transport, just because it is further to the subtropical jet, and we get kind of bigger low centers. So we'll see this low center come in next week, and then even more so after that. So that one is particularly concerning. A 986, 983 low coming over the California coast and being underneath high pressure, which blocks it, is not necessarily the most typical thing in the world, but ultimately, and it might contribute to quite a bit of rainfall in those particular regions. But that is ultimately what is up ahead. And then also in terms of what we're expecting here in the southeast, by virtue of that, we'll have the high pressure start to build over the Bering Strait, but also downstream of this, we have a quite significant Rex block forming over the Hudson Bay. And you can see with these these are 500 millibar geopotential height anomalies. So these are areas of blue where they're expecting low pressure centers to form, which is where we get our storm systems. And this is a little bit further out in the future. We're looking at the Euro, though, and Euro was proven to be the more reliable model based off some of the research that that some of the people at the AMS conference in Baltimore are currently discussing, that I've been following along on Twitter. Euro's doing a really good job this year, or this past year, and it's forming, and this is kind of a new thing that at least I've kind of noticed, is we have obviously low pressure centers forming, which would be indicative of these atmospheric rivers starting to affect the West Coast. But actually, this has tightened quite a bit over here in the southeastern region over Louisiana, and this tightening of this particular troughing pattern with the high pressure here, it is I don't want to say it's concerning, but it's definitely, as far as like a severe weather point of view, this is something that I would kind of start to raise that first kind of flag of like maybe we need to start looking into this a little bit more specifically. If that starts to dip, that's an area of convergence. At the surface in the left exit region of that generalized jet pattern, that might indicate a little bit more of a convective initiation in probably in mid next week, early the next week, Sunday. So what is this? So like, yeah, I'd say late weekend. And it's just something that, like these are just anomalies. It's nothing set in stone. But the atmosphere, as far as what the Euro is predicting, it's just by having this high pressure here, if this disrupts the polar vortex any, we could get a little bit more channeling of cold air in the plains. I don't think it would be largely a snow event by any means. I think we're just too warm, and we've been warm for too long here in the Carolinas and the Southeast for it to warrant that. I think this is more of like this would be a southern ridge rider severe possibility if this were to come to fruition. And if the Madden-Julian oscillation decides to make its way into phase 8, which I think this is kind of like a weird teleconnection to be able to say that, you can see some means are kind of making its way into that diagram right there. We could be looking at some storminess moving into the latter portions of the next weekend. So that's what I'm looking at today. I appreciate y'all tuning in. Once again, this is Great Atmosphere. My name is Zach. I'll be doing forecasting videos like this, particularly for the Southeast U.S., every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I appreciate your subscription, particularly if you live in those areas. I feel like this information would be quite useful to you. And besides that, I look forward to speaking with y'all again on Wednesday. Thank you for tuning in.